the Toronto Star. I'm Saba Itazaz, and this matters. Last week, the government boosted Ontario's minimum wage to $15, after being the government that froze it 3 years ago. A government that has sailed on the slogan of open for business is looking to change its approach, and an election is 7 months away. The last 2 years of this pandemic hit everyone differently. It's undeniable that it hit us inequitably, and those with the lowest incomes but the most precarious jobs, the frontline essential workers, they paid the highest price. Now, a government that was previously criticized for favoring businesses seems to be trying to make amends. Last week, it was announced that minimum wage would be raised to $15 an hour starting January 2022. Ontario has also proposed an omnibus labor legislation, including a number of labor-friendly policies like more rights for temp and migrant workers and a flashy new right to disconnect proposal. But many say a minimum wage is not a living wage. And others ask if these new changes might be a case of too little too late around the corner from a provincial election. Ontario's Labour Minister Monte McNaughton is joining me on This Matters to face some of these questions and also clear the confusion on the new labour legislation and what it means. Hello, Minister McNaughton. Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast.
I'm really excited to be with you today.
So lots of things happening at the Labour Ministry, lots of positive changes, and I want to get right down to it, to some of the things making news this past few weeks. To minimum wage, which is going up to $15 an hour from $14.35. Your government opposed this in 2018, in fact, campaigned around this. Why the U-turn by Premier Ford, and why now? Would you like to respond to critics who see recent overtures as an attempt to lure the immigrant vote with the election just around the corner?
Well, look, everything we're doing, the reforms that we're bringing forward is to ensure that workers have bigger paychecks, more take-home pay to support themselves and their families. We're also doing everything we can to improve workplace protections for workers. I mean, every worker deserves to come home safe after a hard day's work, but we're also creating more opportunities. I think of some of the work we're doing around the skilled trades to get more people into these great career opportunities. So the minimum wage increase is going to help 760,000 frontline workers that have served our families and communities during this pandemic. And it's all part of our plan to build back a better province.
Right. I know you weren't part of that decision making, but the minimum wage was set to go up by 2019 and then increase at the inflation rate from there before the PC party scrapped it. So what would you say to workers who have lost out on thousands of dollars in lost wages because of that?
Well, I've been clear. I mean, we're not going to go back to where we were before the pandemic. This is about building back a fair society for workers. The people that are making a general minimum wage today are going to see a pay increase of about $1,400 per year. But we've even gone further. If you work in a restaurant serving liquor, you're going to go from $12.55 an hour to $15 an hour. That's a pay bump of over $5,000 per year. Again, we're bringing in a lot of reforms. I just introduced the Working for Workers Act. If that's passed, it's going to lead to more workplace protections, more take-home pay, more opportunities for workers.
We will be getting into that a little bit as well. Let's speak about the timing. This announcement on the minimum wage has literally come during Living Wage Week, and the latest numbers from the Ontario Living Wage Network show that there's no municipality in Ontario, basically, where anyone can survive on $15 an hour. In Toronto, in fact, it's $22, and elsewhere, it's pretty close to that. And this is pretty basic, like shelter, food, clothes, utilities, etc. So do you think this current proposed wage is reasonable enough for somebody to live in this province?
Well, look, this is a start. We have more to come around this. One of the things that I'm really excited about and proud about is our second career redesign. We are ensuring that any worker that has lost their job during the pandemic or had hours reduced, they're eligible for up to $28,000 for retraining programs. All of the programs are 12 months or under, and it's to ensure that workers get better paying jobs in jobs that are actually in demand in their own community. So again, there's a lot happening. The minimum wage increase is a start. It's going to be, a bump in pay for 760,000 workers. But we don't want to stop there. We want people to get more opportunities in jobs that are in demand.
And so, like you're saying, there is a multi-tiered approach to this, but also there is a lot of research now by economists on how better wages and paying people enough money to spend it has a positive impact on the economy as well. Wouldn't it have been better to look at a more significant increase in terms of minimum wage as well?
Well, again, this is a start. We know in the last number of months, inflation has really, hit the pockets of workers and families across the province. Again, we're not stopping here. We want to retrain and upskill and train workers for better jobs. Again, I think of the skilled trades, we're going to be short 100,000 workers in construction over the next number of years. We all know people in the trades making six figures with defined pensions and benefits. There's a lot of great opportunities out there, and we really just want to connect the dots for those workers that are unemployed or are, say, for example, making minimum wage to get these great jobs that are out there.
You referred to legislation that's being proposed for better protection for workers, for more benefit to workers. Do you want to talk about some of the salient points before I get into some of the technicalities, some questions that I have?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm proud we've worked really hard on this legislation. Premier Ford has really driven a lot of these changes. I think, for example, of the changes we're bringing to crack down on temporary help agencies, 130,000 workers in Ontario are hired through temp help agencies. And we've all heard for many, many years the horrific circumstances that many of these workers are a part of. I mean, we've heard stories of temp help agencies taking passports away, tracking movements of workers, making below minimum wage. I'm proud that we're bringing forward comprehensive reforms to ensure that the bad actors are shut down and that there's more worker protections.
Mm-hmm. And along with these changes, I know you've been working on the PC Party's relationship with the unions and unionized labor, but it's also important to see that you are listening to the most vulnerable workers and those who've paid the biggest price during the pandemic. And these are the temp workers and the gig workers who might not have the protection of the unions. So what else do you have in mind for them? Is there any work being done for enforcement on existing rules as well for protection that was already there, like the ESA? And there were reports in 2016 by your own ministry, and then in 2017, which talks about loopholes there. Is that also being looked at as part of the reforms?
Well, one of the actions we've taken is to hire 100 new health and safety inspectors. It brings the inspectorate to the largest in provincial history. When it comes to the temp help agencies, I mean, we know most of them are playing by the rules, but it's really to focus on those lawbreakers. So we're going to have a dedicated team of investigators and inspectors just to ensure that those workers are protected. And again, I'm committed to bringing in the highest fines in the country for the temp help agencies and recruiters that aren't playing by the rules. And they could face possible jail time. Again, this has been an issue that's been neglected for many years under different former governments, and we're taking action to clean this up.
But according to those loopholes, Minister, the framework of the ESA was such that many in precarious employment were actually excluded from basic rights and maybe some of these protections that you're talking about. For example, building superintendents might not have access to rest periods or overtime pay, or there's a different sort of mechanism for farm workers. Are you doing anything to expand that framework to bring everybody under that umbrella?
Well, again, this is a major start. My commitment is to ensure that there's more workplace protections for all workers in Ontario, that they get better paychecks and more opportunities in other employment, better paying jobs. One of the things that we brought forward in this legislation, for example, is for app-based workers who've been delivering food, for truck drivers and couriers to have access to washroom facilities. I mean, it's hard to believe in 2021 that we need to legislate this. But again, these have all been our heroes the last couple of years during this pandemic. And we're moving forward to ensure that they have access to washroom facilities.
Mm-hmm. And those are some really positive changes. And like you've mentioned, and as your government has said in the past, these essential workers have been our heroes. And clearly there is focus on reforms to protect and benefit them. But a lot of people say that that debate is sort of incomplete without paid sick leave. Do you see these proposed reforms as an opportunity to include a permanent and effective paid sick leave plan?
Well, I did bring forward what I believe the most comprehensive paid sick day program during the pandemic. We brought in 3 paid sick days here in Ontario. We're the first province to move on that during the pandemic. I can assure workers out there that these will be in place for them as we battle COVID-19. Our paid sick days plan is also very flexible. We've seen the workers that have been using them, they've been using them to get vaccinated, to recuperate from vaccinations, to stay home if they have a son or a daughter that has COVID symptoms and can't go to school. If they're dealing with mental health challenges, they can use our paid sick days. So we're going to continue to ensure that they're in place for workers as we battle this pandemic.
But that is temporary, right? Is there any plans to expand that or expand the framework?
Again, there's more changes to come. We're going to ensure that workers are protected, especially during this pandemic. Currently, the paid sick days programs are 23 days in total, with the federal 4 weeks plus our 3 paid sick days. But I can assure workers that we'll have their backs throughout this pandemic.
We'll be right back. Let's talk about the massive skilled labor shortage, one of the biggest challenges I think that the government is facing. And you talked about plans to address this by 2030. Can you talk to me a little bit about how bad the situation is, why, and how optimistic are you about tackling it?
I think this is one of the greatest economic challenges that we have as a province coming out of this pandemic. We all know those small businesses along main streets in our communities. Most of them have a help wanted sign up. Today in Ontario, for example, 316,000 jobs are going unfilled. These are great jobs, many skilled jobs in the trades, for example. We're really doing everything we can to fill these jobs. One of the pieces of our Working for Workers legislation that's introduced is to recognize foreign credentials of immigrants. Today in Ontario, only 25% of immigrants are actually working in professions that they've studied for. I think it's a huge injustice when we see engineers and architects and other skilled professionals driving taxi, for example. So we want to address this to lift new Canadians up so they can have, more take-home pay to support themselves and their families. But also this is going to go a long ways to filling that labor shortage because there are tens of thousands of new Canadians here that could fill these jobs.
And I believe you've issued a call out to the federal government as well. You're seeking to double the number of skilled labor.
Absolutely. I think immigration can play a huge role in our economic recovery. A couple of the things I've already had a discussion with the new Minister of Immigration, Sean Fraser. We want to double the Ontario Immigrant Nominee Program from 9,000 to 18,000 by next year, but also to play a greater role in the immigration system. I mean, it's important that we're attracting the brightest and the most talented workforce here to Ontario, and immigration will play a key role in that. And I think it's a great opportunity for the federal government and the province to work together for the betterment of communities.
And Minister, like you mentioned, a part of the legislation is about the foreign credential process, which is basically ensuring that Canadian work experience is not a requirement for certain regulated professions, so people can work at their skill levels. Some critics have said that this proposal might fall short of what's needed at a time when Ontario is also experiencing a massive nursing shortage crisis, a crisis in the health profession. Why aren't health professionals included in this legislation?
Well, look, I want to crack that nut as well. I mean, there's more work to do there. This will benefit all the other professions for all of the people that are here in Ontario today that have come from outside of Canada. I admit we need more healthcare professionals. That's one of the reasons why earlier on in the pandemic, I reformed the Ontario Immigrant Nominee Program to prioritize healthcare workers in that group of 9,000 immigrants that we have a say over. And we've actually delivered great results during the pandemic. We've attracted PSWs, a number of doctors and nurses as well. So again, it's all hands on deck. We're certainly not done. I'm working with the Ministry of Health now as we speak. But again, this will benefit really thousands of other workers in other professions like architecture and engineering and a whole bunch of others.
Is it something that might be in the pipeline to expand this to health professionals who've obviously been on the front lines during this pandemic?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm in taxis a lot in Toronto, and we've all talked to taxi drivers that are doctors or nurses or some part of the healthcare system. It's a priority for me to get this done, and we're going to continue to work on this.
And we've been seeing you continue to work on this, continue to change party alignment in a way as well. But many have started sort of associating constant Uturns when it comes to this government and labor issues. For example, worker protection legislation is reversed by the previous government and restored. And also, when the same week you were announcing reforms on this, which included removing barriers for immigrant workers, we also had Premier Ford making some remarks which were considered very insensitive to immigrants as well. Doesn't this this seem like contradictory messaging and sort of the opposite of what you say you're trying to do? What do we make of this?
Actions speak louder than words. I mean, I've been the Minister of Labour, Training and Skills Development now for 2.5 years. And I think of my first days on the job meeting with hundreds of Labour leaders being not only the first Conservative Minister of Labour, but the first Minister of Labour in a long time to march in the Labour Day parade with tens of thousands of workers from across Ontario. I have taken the approach that Labour, government, and industry or business have to work together. I mean, this global pandemic has impacted everyone. If we're truly going to achieve bigger paychecks, more workplace protections, and creating more opportunities and spreading opportunity more widely and fairly, we all have to work together. That's the approach I've been taking since being appointed by Premier Ford, and this is the approach we're going to continue to take.
Do you think you have your job cut out for you? Do you think that's going to be a bit of a hard sell for a party that came to power on the slogan of open for business and reverse labor reforms, including paid sick days, a freeze on minimum wage, and protections for precarious workers, some of which you are now restoring in effect?
Look, again, this is about building back a better province. I'm proud to say that under Premier Ford, we're leading the way in these changes, not only in Canada, but across North America. I mean, I think of our actions to ensure that people can disconnect from work, to have a better balance between work life and personal life and family time, banning non-competes, for example, to increase labor mobility. I mean, on that issue specifically, I mean, we're seeing now, even in fast food restaurants, bosses are bringing in non-compete clauses to intimidate workers. That's an injustice, and it really hurts labor mobility as well. And we need to create the best workforce, the most talented workforce in the country here in Ontario.
Can you clarify a little bit on the right to disconnectivity legislation as well? How do you plan to implement that? There's been some confusion around it.
Well, we're the first province in the country to move forward with legislating a right to disconnect policy, requiring all employers that have 25 or more employees to post a right to disconnect policy. They have to communicate that with their workers. It's going to be part of the Employment Standards Act. Again, the lines between, work time and family time and personal time have been blurred during this pandemic. We've all, been working from home in many cases. So it's important just to ensure that employers are communicating when workers can disconnect from their jobs.
So how are you going to implement that? Are you going to fine these companies a lot to make their workers work less? And how would that affect the traditional party relationship with businesses? How would you keep that balance?
Well, again, I see this as a win for employers and employees. I mean, if workers are, not faced with mental health challenges, when they have, time where they're truly disconnected from work, they're going to be more productive and happy. That's why, we're putting this in the Employment Standards Act, and our inspectors will ensure that there is a policy in place. But also, I think it's important to know that this will be tailored to specific workplaces. It's not a one-size-fits-all solution. Every specific workplace will have to have a policy that is tailored to their workplace.
I know you're working on these positive changes, but at the same time, the minimum wage, it's not a living wage. We're still talking about paid sick days. We are frankly lagging behind many other countries on that front. Do you think what's currently being proposed is enough to help gain back the trust of some of the most vulnerable in the workforce on whom the pandemic took its heaviest toll, a lot of which they see as due to delayed action and more than 2 years of harmful policies by the Ford government?
Well, as I said, there's more to come, but we've taken, I think nation-leading legislation to Queen's Park to improve the lives of workers across the province. We're going to continue working every single day to build back a stronger, more fair economy for everyone. I've also been clear that not everyone is receiving their fair share of the economic pie. And all of these changes are to, work for workers. But ultimately, I think all of the changes that we're bringing forward are going to benefit the economy as a whole and create more jobs and more take-home pay.
Minister Monte McNaughton, thank you so much for your time and for patiently answering all of our questions.
Thanks for having me.
I was talking to Ontario's Labour Minister Monte McNaughton. That's it for today. Thanks so much for listening. I'm your host, Sabai Tazaz. The This Matters team is Adrian Chung, Brian Bradley, JP Fozo, Matt Hearn, Morgan Bucknick, Raju Mutter, and Sean Pattenton. Our music is by So-Called, Mike DeAngelis, and Sean Pattenton. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com/subscribingmatters And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.